Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm a writer of many novels, but I also run the centre where we teach creative writing and do this podcast, amongst many other things. And today I am joined again, I'm delighted to say, by Holly Ordway, who we first met when we were talking about her book, Tolkien's Modern Reading. But her next book, which comes out at the end of August, is an exploration of Tolkien's faith. And it does what it says on the tin because it is called Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography. Now, Holly, do you want to tell us a little bit about your own story about how you came to write this, and where you sit within the academic world as well, so we got a sense of where you're coming from?
Right. Well, first of all, it is a pleasure to be back on the show and to be talking about my favorite author. And as we come up to the 50th anniversary of his death, which is September 2nd of 2023, it's a good moment to kind of try and take stock of the full picture of his life. And one of the things that I realized as I was researching and writing Tolkien's Modern Reading, which was a 10-year project, that book took a long time to write and to research. I kept discovering along the way lots of references to his faith that were kind of adding up to a richer picture. I knew already that he was a Catholic, that he was a devout Christian. That's widely recognized. But I had gotten the impression from the biographies that I had read that it was a bit compartmentalized. And of course, there's the debate, to what extent is The Lord of the Rings a Christian book? This is a very complex question because Tolkien himself says very famously in a letter that The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously in the writing, but consciously in the revision. Wow, that's a pretty firm statement. Yet he goes on to say that's why I've cut out all the overt references to religion, which, okay, that's interesting choice. And the book itself, as with all of his writings, is accessible to writers of any faith and to no faith, as I know myself from personal experience, because I am myself now a Catholic, but I grew up sort of agnostic, nothing particular, a nun, became an atheist when I was undergraduate, and was reading Tolkien during all this time, as an agnostic, as an atheist, and then later as a Christian. So I know firsthand that you can love Tolkien and be moved by him without even having much awareness of his faith, let alone sharing it. I mean, I was quite hostile to his faith for much of, my early life, yet I still loved him. So how do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of this question? And that's been in kind of the back of my mind. And then as I researched Tolkien's Modern Reading, coming across so many references to the depth of his faith and the way that it was such an important part of his life made me realize that there needed to be a reconsideration, a reexamination of his spiritual life to get the big picture of it. Now, along with this, there comes the fact that I'm obviously an American, but I spend a great deal of time in England. I spend time there every year and have done for about 15 years now. I spend several months every year in Oxford. And so I worship in the same churches that Tolkien worshipped as a Catholic. I've been deeply influenced personally by English Catholicism. And I began to realize that for American Christians, English Catholicism is a whole different world. And that's the world that Tolkien grew up in. And then specifically within that, the Oratorians, the Birmingham Oratorians, realizing that the Birmingham Oratory wasn't just the name of a church where his guardian happened to be a pastor. It's the Congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri, which was brought to England by John Henry Newman, which is a whole congregation. It has a spirituality of its own, a very distinctive spirituality. And I remember one time I had gone to mass. I think I'd gone to confession and mass at St. Aloysius, which is now the Oxford Oratory, although it wasn't in Tolkien's day. And I remember walking out and thinking to myself, wow, the Oratorians, their spirituality, their liturgy is very Tolkienian. And then I stopped and said to myself, wait a second, I've got that reversed. And that was one of the things that started to make me interested in exploring not just the biographical fact that Tolkien had been raised effectively by an Oratorian priest, but what was the influence of Oratorian spirituality on him? And what was the influence of being raised, of growing up as a convert? Because he was a convert. He became a Catholic when he was old enough to remember. What was the impact of growing up as a Catholic in English Catholicism? And that became a major part of the research for Tolkien's faith, putting Tolkien into his context, especially of Catholicism, as an utterly marginalized and socially, minimal and socially disliked and marginalized community. I mean, they didn't even have full civil rights until well into Tolkien's adulthood, which was a sort of a shocking fact to realize.
Yeah, so just to set it goes back to Henry VIII, everybody. So if you're listening to this in America, you're probably aware of Henry VIII and his wives, but how that all kicks off is he doesn't have a legitimate heir, and his first wife, who's Catherine of Aragon, she is getting a bit old, and he thinks this isn't going to work, and so he wants to get a divorce. He's not allowed a divorce because it's a legitimate marriage in the eyes of the church, and she's well connected. So this forces the rupture, where you get this division, where you get the Church of England set up separately, which allows him to go ahead and sort of basically undo the power of the Catholic Church, because up to that point the Catholic Church was very much part of the state, and the Anglican Church, the Church of England, then was set up as the state church, and still is our established church. So at the coronation, that is what King Charles III swore that he would be head of, because it has the monarch at the head. That isn't like the Pope at all. He doesn't then decree on things. It's just a figurehead role. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the head. So there's a whole separate history that then sets off. And the Catholics are seen as the enemy, like insurgents, really, for quite a few years. And a lot of the history of the next 300 years, 400 years is explained by this, including things that people would have heard of, like the Gunpowder Plot and Guy Fawkes and the Jacobite Rising and things like that. It's all to do with this split. So roll forward, and I'm sure I'm teaching a lot of people here things they already know, so I won't go on about it, but just it's interesting context that the Catholics were regarded as other. So when his mother becomes a Catholic, which wasn't the faith of her family, it sets her apart. It's a bit like, I don't know, a child now converting, say, Muslim to Christian or Christian to Muslim. It was a division, whereas now we don't see much of a difference. At the time, it would have been regarded as quite a big step, which made her quite an isolated figure. And it also sort of explains why it was the church fathers who became the guardians for the boys, because that's where she had her family. So that's just trying to explain why being a Catholic wasn't just a kind of shrug thing, which is now it's fine, nobody bats an eyelid. Then there was still the hangover of these centuries of problems between the church and the state. That thing you said about how the liturgy is very Tolkienian, or Tolkien was inspired, is fascinating. I can't wait to read your book so that I can find out the detail of that. But what do you think that there was in the English version of Catholicism in particular that inspired Tolkien creatively? Is there anything you can think, oh yes, there's some kind of aesthetic here, some sort of feeling about his faith that then becomes woven into the creation of Middle Earth?
Well, yeah, this is a huge question. To kind of narrow it down a little bit, to be a Catholic in England was its own experience, which we've already sort of lightly touched on. But specifically, I think he was really influenced by Oratorian spirituality, which is a charism sort of within, Catholicism. I think often people who are not Catholics, and many who are, tend to think of Catholicism as uniform, like, well, this is what all Catholics do. There are obviously many things that all Catholics do, but there's a lot of diversity of sort of spiritualities within Catholicism. The Dominicans are very much, their ministry is preaching. Their churches tend to be much sort of simpler, like Blackfriars in Oxford, very sort of simple, plain design. There's the Franciscans with the emphasis on poverty of life. And so there's different sort of spiritualities within Catholicism. And Oratorian spirituality is not very well known. This is the congregation founded by Saint Philip Neri, who was an Italian saint, 16th century, who inspires the oratory in Rome, and it spreads to other places. And John Henry Newman brought it to England. And there are a couple of interesting points about the Oratorians. One is that they place a particular emphasis on ministering to the more highly educated in the community. They always go into cities, and so Birmingham, for instance, and they place a great emphasis on music and beauty in the liturgy. And this is then an aesthetic that he grew up in this real sense of beauty. And we can't take that for granted, because not all English Catholic churches are, or certainly would have been then, beautiful or with good music, because partly as a result of the Reformation and the establishment of the Church of England, all of the existing churches, which had been Catholic up to that point, were converted to Anglicanism. Catholics no longer had places of worship, and even after, and for a long time, it was illegal to be a Catholic, to attend Mass. Even after those penalties were lifted, it wasn't until 1791 that Catholics could even build churches again. And even then, there were restrictions. They couldn't, for instance, put steeples on them for a long time because it would call too much attention to these Catholic places. And of course, Catholics in England were much poorer, significantly poorer than their Anglican counterparts. So the churches tended to be cheaper and uglier, generally speaking. And so there's a real cost in lots of ways to becoming a Catholic, not just socially, but even aesthetically. And that would have been something that Tolkien would have been well aware of. In the oratory, he had the great privilege of being able to grow up surrounded by beauty. And interestingly, he would also have seen that happening, because when he and his mother and his little brother started worshiping at the Birmingham Oratory, it was not the big, beautiful church that we see now if we go and visit it. That was built during Tolkien's teenage years. It was originally a very small, shabby, kind of blah building that was then rebuilt into this big, beautiful church, sort of built up around him. So he has this early exposure to beauty and music, and a sense that it's important, that it's not just a little optional extra, that it's an important way that we worship, that we express our faith. And one other point I'll just make briefly, although I talk about it at much greater length in the book, oratory and spirituality really puts a great emphasis on joy. It's a spirituality of joy, but it's a spirituality that incorporates sorrow. Joy is not the same thing as happiness. And I think that this has a profound influence on Tolkien, and we can see it in many ways throughout his whole work, all of his ability to get through these sorrowful periods and still have a sense of joy. That's very much in line with the spirituality of the Oratorians.
I suppose the one big difference, thinking about it, between Middle Earth perception of faith and what we might or might not believe is they knew the gods were there. The Valar were over in the Undying Lands. And there's nobody who says, oh, Eru Ilúvatar doesn't exist. It's not a world of doubt. Do you agree? It can be a world of despair, but...
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, Tolkien is obviously writing Middle-earth from a point of view of natural theology. This is a pre-Christian world. He's very clear. It's a pre-Christian world. So there isn't any Christ figure in it. And he's also very clear that the Valar are angels. Angels are archangels. And he makes the point in one of his letters that the inhabitants of Middle-earth might call on the Valar as a Catholic would on a saint. So they're intercessory figures. But of course, Eru Ilúvatar, who Tolkien is quite clear is God as he understands him, the one God, the God. I mean, he is not visible to the people of Middle-earth in that sense, just as now, perhaps much less so, because this is pre-incarnation. And we see not so much in Lord of the Rings, but in the Legendarium, the story of Numenor is a story of worship of Eru perverted into human sacrifice and worship of Morgoth. So I think Tolkien's not specifically working in the modern, very modern struggle with does God exist, because he's working in a natural theological framework in which he's taking it for granted that God does exist. But he's still certainly giving plenty of room for the people of Middle-earth to act as if God doesn't exist and to go.
No, that's true. And there's also plenty of room for the bad guys and the fallen good guys to try and, achieve a power that is not appropriate for mortal or immortal people even, like the ring, for example, because it corrupts. But this theme is making me think some interest. It's intriguing me, and I'm sure this is what I'm going to be reading your book to find out, is things like, well, why can't men and other races go to the land, the undying world? Why can't they go there? Why are they separated? Why are only elves allowed? Because that's the place where the angels hang out. Why do men not know what happens to them after death, whereas elves do know that they wait in the halls of Mandos? And there's some suggestion that they sort of come back again. They don't leave the confines of the world. These are all really perplexing theological questions in a sense, but they're very different from the kind of theological questions we would be asking in our world, because we don't have those dilemmas.
Maybe disagree, because I think we are asking those questions. I mean, we don't ask them the same way as the elves, because we're humans, not elves. But what happens when we die is quite possibly the question, right? What does happen? Can we be sure? Where do we go? That's as profound a question now as it would be for Beren in Middle Earth.
But what I meant was, there isn't a group of people who have like special access, like that part, the big division between elves and men, the more immortal, and that obviously isn't our lived experience. So
right,
the theology of that, why that is set up like that, is something which is made up for Middle Earth.
And that's what I think Tolkien's his way. He's exploring certain questions. Now, obviously, fundamentally, Tolkien is telling a story. It's the narrative, the characters. I mean, his elves come out of his languages. So we mustn't ever fall into the trap of thinking that he had a theological puzzle he wanted to work out, and so therefore he created X, Y, and Z characters. That's utterly antithetical to Tolkien's way of thinking. But That doesn't mean that he didn't think about these things and weave them in, because he writes, for instance, that the main theme of Lord of the Rings is death and the desire for deathlessness. And this is a theme that he explores throughout the whole legendarium. And the elves allow him to do this in a really interesting way, because the elves don't experience death in the same way that humans do. So what it effectively allows him to do, by contrast, is to explore what does death mean? In what way is death a gift to the human race? Why might elves view it as a gift when we might view it as a burden? So the separation of the elves as these people who did have a chance to see the light more directly, and yet they still managed to fall and rebel. I mean, the whole story of Silmarillion is, Feanor, please stop it.
Yeah, exactly.
Feanor, no. Feanor,
give up. They're not yours.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a sense, Tolkien is exploring this idea of, what do we do with the light that is given to us? Just because the elves had a more privileged access to that light did not immediately empower them to lead perfect lives. His elves are so far from being sinless, perfect people. They're really not. But they have different gifts and different temptations. And I think that allows him to explore things like temptation and grace. Much grace is given to the elves. What do they do with it? Well, that's exactly the question that any Catholic would have to answer. Like, well, we have all this abundant grace coming to us in the sacraments. What am I doing with it? Am I attempting to conform to it, or am I just saying whatever and turning away from it? So I think this gives him a freedom to work with these themes, which is the freedom that fantasy gives.
I think that's a probably more helpful way. The way you're talking about it is you see a theme like grace that is playing amongst the elves, and you then take that out. I was just getting a bit panicked by thinking about the other way in, when you're sort of looking for how it goes the other way. And I think that, so the idea of overweening ambition, the Numenor story, the falling for the tempter, the corruption, it's not really a question of a why question. It's oh yeah, I've seen that before, and isn't it that particular thing of the fall? And of course the Numenor is interesting. It's the only place with an actual mentioned place of worship, isn't it? It sort of escapes the delete line. So Holly, I'm really looking forward to reading this, but we also have to, of course, face up to the fact that for some people in the Tolkien fandom out there, find mention of Tolkien's faith and Catholicism not something they're sympathetic with, and indeed something which scares them or makes them feel a bit outside the Tolkien's world in a way. So how do you feel he handles his faith and the way it attaches it to his creativity that actually suits our diverse world? You said at the beginning that you had your own experience of sort of coming through various stages of faith, no faith, to being Catholic. So you obviously were able to navigate that yourself. But for someone who's listening who doesn't have a faith or is from another faith, is Tolkien still okay to read, or is he only preaching to the choir, shall we say?
Well, he is. You should read him. He is. Yes, read Tolkien. And this is something that I found very encouraging for me as I researched this book. And one thing I want to note, when I wrote Tolkien's Faith, I'm very keenly aware that he has a readership of so many people who don't share his faith, who may be, as you noted, a little bit maybe nervous about it or off-putting. And so as in this interview, I've been quite straightforward. In the first chapter, I say, look, I am myself a Catholic. I share his belief. But, and I say this right in the beginning, the first chapter, it has been my effort in the book to be just treating of his faith as he understood it. I neither critique it nor recommend it. My interest is exploring what did it mean to him, because he's a genius. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably don't have any, argument with that. He's a brilliant writer. So if it was important to him, I think it should be important to us. We don't have to share it. We don't have to like it. But I think it's really important to approach his faith without any presumption of either affirming it or rejecting it, because both of those attitudes lead to distortions where you find what you want to find, whether it's positive or whether it's negative. And as I looked at Tolkien's life, I realized that he had grown up really in such a way as to have a lot of sympathy and openness to all sorts of different people. He had the experience of being a convert who then was mentored by the Oratorians, who were themselves nearly all converts and had a great deal of sympathy for Anglicanism. So from the beginning, he was not raised by men who thought, oh, the Church of England is evil, Protestants are all heretics. No, they said, well, we have this blessing of becoming Catholics, but the Church of England they're still Christians, and they are, in some sense, really anticipating what will be explicitly taught at Vatican II. That was what was lived out in Tolkien's life in the influence of John Henry Newman, was a kind of, early ecumenism, saying, okay, well, we differ, but we're not enemies. He went to school at a Protestant school, King Edward's School, which I learned was distinctive in that not only did it have both Catholics and Protestants, but even Jewish students. And that is very not typical of English, schools of his day. So he grows up with friends from diverse backgrounds. And throughout his whole life, he has friends who are Protestants of all different kinds. And also he has friends and acquaintances who are not believers. And he's always quite forthright. Like, well, this is my faith. No one ever thought he wasn't a Catholic, but he's always able to relate to other people and not to let it be a barrier between them. It's quite moving, really, some of the things that he writes and says about his non-Catholic friends. So I think that folks who are a little bit maybe worried, like, oh, if I read a book about Tolkien as a Catholic, am I gonna learn that he was really a bigot who thought that everybody was going to go to hell if they weren't a Catholic? I can give a little bit of a reassurance. He was serious in his faith, and some of what he believed might be challenging or a little bit difficult. How did he believe those things? But he definitely had an openness and a respect, and a sense that God is working in people's lives in all sorts of ways that he can't judge, and he didn't try to judge. So you need to have no fear, dear reader. I think you'll find that you get a much better picture of who he was and what was important to him, and that's, I think, useful for any reader of Tolkien, whatever their faith background might be.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good place to, land this discussion. So we look forward to seeing that book and having a reset. I particularly like the idea of actually being a bit more clever about understanding what Catholicism is, rather than just saying he's a Catholic, saying actually there are many flavors. And this particular one is the one that we see working its way through his work. In honor of this discussion, we're going to do our special segment on where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place for something, to choose best place for a place of worship. Now, this does not have to be in any sense a world religion. It can be a made-up one on a moon. It's just the idea of where do you think would be a good place to go and experience the worship of that world in whatever context that is.
Well, you did give me warning on this, and so I was able to think about this, and I think I will pull up a Tolkien example, and I would go to the passage in Lord of the Rings where Frodo and Sam have been going through Ithilien. They've encountered Faramir and his crew, and he's brought them to their secret cave, and then they're about to have the meal. And then I'll go ahead and I'll just read. I pulled out the passage. It says, they were led then to seats beside Faramir, barrels covered with pelts and high enough above the benches of the men for their convenience. Before they ate, Faramir and all his men turned and faced west in a moment of silence. Faramir signed to Frodo and Sam that they should do likewise. So we always do, he said, as they sat down. We look toward Numenor that was, and beyond to Elvenhome that is, and to that which is beyond Elvenhome and will ever be.
Very liturgical.
Very much so, very much so. And this is in fact one of the instances of religion that Tolkien chose to leave in. This is an example of a sort of natural theology of worship. And I think I like that as an example of a place or occasion of worship, because it kind of gets to the foundations, that it isn't necessarily, it isn't just about the place. This is about a recognition of what was and what is to come, whatever that might mean to you at that particular moment. It's a good thing to be reflecting on. And I think it's a very inviting moment in the Lord of the Rings. So I would pick that. I would join in that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect example. So I've got to choose something different. So the thing that came to my mind is early on in Out of Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis, when Ransom, who's been basically kidnapped and taken on board a spaceship, it's very Flash Gordon in its kind of technology. But anyway, this spaceship has a sort of deck where you can see out. And the great revelation that Ransom has is that ours is the dark, silent planet. And the solar system that he's traveling in is the singing spheres. It's using that medieval idea of the heavens and giving it a sort of sci-fi makeover. But there's a description of Ransom lying naked, bathed in this light, and just sort of absorbing the praise of the universe. It's a marvelous piece of writing. It's when C.S. Lewis seems to really take off and produce some amazing word pictures. So it's like a moment of worship on a spaceship. So that's my offering.
Oh, and I love that passage. That's such a great scene.
Yeah.
And that great line where, the idea of space, emptiness, is a blasphemous libel, because that's not what it is. It's full of it's the heavens, which is why we should call it the Ransom trilogy or the Cosmic trilogy and not the Space trilogy.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
That's a great passage.
Thank you so much, Holly, for joining us, and we wish you all the best with that new book. And yeah, I'm waiting to get my hands on a copy.
Excellent. Well, my pleasure.
Thank you.